If you or someone in your family depends on a Social Security check, I'm about to change how you plan your budget for next year, because brand new numbers that give us our clearest look yet at how much more money in your bank account starting January 2027, and whether that actually be enough to keep up what things really cost. So stick with this video, because by the end you'll know exactly what they're predicting, why their estimates have been jumping around so much this year, how much extra money person might expect based on your current benefit amount, and the one hidden cost that could quietly eat into a big chunk of that raise before it reaches your pocket. Let's start with the basics, because even if you've heard the term COLA 100 times, it's worth a quick refresher so everything else in this video makes sense. COLA stands for Cost of Living Adjustment, and it's the mechanism Social Security uses every single year to try to make sure your benefit doesn't lose purchasing power as prices rise. The Social Security Administration calculates it by comparing something called the CPIW, which is the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, during the third quarter of the current year, that's July, August, and September, against that same 3-month window from the previous year. Whatever percentage difference shows up between those two periods becomes the official COLA, and that new percentage gets applied to checks starting the following January. It's a system that sounds simple on paper, but in practice it means beneficiaries are essentially waiting on inflation data that reflects the past, which can create a lag between what things actually cost right now and what their check is adjusted to cover. Now, here's where it gets interesting for 2027. Multiple independent organizations that track this data closely have been publishing their own early forecasts for months, and the numbers have shifted quite a bit as new inflation reports have rolled in. Back in the spring of this year, some estimates climbed as high as 4.2 to 4.7%, driven largely by an energy price shock and a hot inflation reading in April. If those higher numbers had held, we would have been looking at one of the largest Social Security raises since the 8.7% adjustment back in 2023. But inflation has since cooled, and the most recent projections reflect that shift. As of the middle of July 2026, the Senior Citizens League, a nonpartisan senior advocacy organization that's been tracking COLA projections for years, held its estimate steady at 3.8%, which is actually unchanged from its June projection, but slightly down from an earlier 3.9% reading back in April. Independent policy analyst Mary Johnson, who has built a reputation for closely following Social Security and Medicare trends, made a more dramatic adjustment, dropping her estimate to 3.7%, which is a full percentage point lower than the 4.7% she had projected just a month earlier. Meanwhile, AARP released its own analysis based on the latest Bureau of Labor Statistics data and landed on a slightly more conservative 3.6%. So depending on which organization you're looking at, the range right now sits somewhere between 3.6 and 3.8%, and all three of these projections are still meaningfully higher than the 2.8% COLA that actually took effect back in January 2026. To put that in perspective, the COLA has averaged around 3.1% over the past decade. And if you go back even further, from 2001 through 2025, the historical average sits closer to 2.6%, so even the more modest enders projections would land above the long-term historical trend. Now let's talk about what this actually means in dollars, because percentages are nice for headlines, but what most people really want to know is how much more money they'll actually see. According to the Social Security Administration, the average monthly benefit for a retired worker was $2,084.40 as of June 2026. If the Senior Citizens League's estimate of 3.8% turns out to be accurate, that would translate to an increase of roughly $79.21 per month, which adds up to about $950.52 over the full year. If Mary Johnson's middle-of-the-road estimate of 3.7% ends up being closer to the mark, that would mean an increase of about $77.12 per month, or around $925.44 annually. And if AARP's slightly more conservative 3.6% estimate proves correct, that would work out to roughly $75 per month, or about $900 for the year. Now, those numbers might sound like a meaningful bump, and for many households they genuinely will help. But there's an important piece of this puzzle that often gets left out of the conversation, and that's Medicare. For most retirees, Medicare Part B premiums are automatically deducted directly from their Social Security check before it ever reaches their bank account, so any increase in that premium effectively offsets part of your COLA raise. According to estimates from the most recent Medicare Trustees Report, the standard Medicare Part B premium is projected to rise from $202.90 per month in 2026 to somewhere in the range of $209.50, possibly even as high as around $218.60, depending on which projection you're looking at, for 2027. That's an increase of roughly $7 to $16 a month just for Part B coverage alone, and higher income beneficiaries could face even steeper surcharges on top of that base premium. On the prescription drug side, the initial deductible for Medicare Part D is expected to rise as well, moving from $615 in 2026 up to around $700 in 2027. So when you're mentally calculating how much extra breathing room your COLA increase will actually give you, it's worth remembering that a portion of that raise, sometimes a fairly significant portion depending on your Medicare enrollment and income level, may effectively get absorbed by rising healthcare costs before you ever notice the difference in your bank account. This is actually a pattern that repeats almost every year, and it's one of the most common sources of frustration among retirees, because the headline COLA percentage sounds like a straightforward raise, but the real-world take-home impact is often smaller once Medicare premiums are factored in. It's also worth mentioning that these are still estimates, not the final number. The Social Security Administration will not announce the official, locked-in COLA for 2027 until mid-October of this year, based on the actual third-quarter CPI data collected in July, August, and September. That means there are still a couple more inflation reports that need to come out before we know for certain where this number will land, and history has shown these projections can move, sometimes significantly, in either direction as new data comes in. For example, ongoing geopolitical tensions, particularly around global oil supply, have been cited by multiple analysts as a wildcard that could push inflation, and therefore the COLA estimate higher if energy prices spike again, or lower if things stabilize. Beyond the raw number, there's a broader conversation happening in Washington right now about how COLA itself is calculated, and this is worth knowing about because it could affect future adjustments for years to come. Congress has reintroduced a piece of legislation called the Social Security 2100 Act, which if passed would make several notable changes to the program. It would raise benefits across the board by 2%. It would set a new minimum benefit equal to 125% of the federal poverty line, and perhaps most significantly for this conversation, it would change the underlying formula used to calculate COLA, shifting away from the current CPI-W index towards something called the CPI-E, which stands for the Consumer Price Index for the elderly. The idea behind this proposed change is that the CPI-W, the index currently used, is based on the spending patterns of urban wage earners and clerical workers, a group that doesn't necessarily reflect how older Americans actually spend their money, particularly when it comes to healthcare costs, which tend to make up a much larger share of a retiree's budget than a working-age person's budget. Proponents of switching to CPI-E argue it would produce COLA adjustments that more accurately track the specific expenses seniors face year after year. As of now, this bill has been reintroduced but has not passed, so it's something to watch rather than something that's already changed how your benefit is calculated. But it does reflect a broader and ongoing debate about whether the current system truly keeps pace with the real cost of aging in America. So what should you actually do with all of this information right now, today, before the official number comes out in October? First, it's smart to treat every estimate you see between now and then, including the ones in this video, as just that, an estimate, and to avoid making any major financial commitments based solely on a projected percentage that could still shift. Second, if you're currently receiving benefits or planning to file soon, it's worth taking a few minutes to log into your online Social Security account to review your most recent benefit statement and to understand exactly how a percentage increase, whatever it ends up being, would translate into real dollars for your specific situation, since averages don't always reflect individual circumstances. Third, if you're enrolled in Medicare or planning to enroll soon, keep an eye on Part B and Part D premium announcements as they come out, because as we discussed, those costs directly interact with your COLA increase and will affect how much of that raise you actually get to keep. And finally, if you want to stay ahead of the official announcement, mark your calendar for mid-October, because that's when the Social Security Administration will release the confirmed final COLA percentage for 2027, along with updated Medicare premium figures shortly after. New rounds of estimates from these tracking organizations typically get released monthly following each fresh inflation report. So if this topic you or your family, it's worth checking back as we get closer to that October announcement, because the picture could still shift somewhat between now and then. To wrap things up, here's the bottom line. Based on the most current data available as of early August 2026, most independent forecaster are projecting a 2027 Social Security COLA somewhere between 3.6 and 0.8%, which would mark a meaningful increase to year's 2.8% adjustment and would represent one of the larger COLA raises in recent years, though still well below the historic 8.7% seen in 2023. For the average retired worker, that could mean somewhere between roughly $75 and $80 more per month, but a portion of that increase is likely to be absorbed by rising Medicare premiums. So the real practical impact on your monthly budget may end up being somewhat smaller than the headline percentage suggests. Nothing here is official yet. The real number arrives in October. And until then, the smartest move is simply to stay informed, plan conservatively, and check back as new data rolls in. If you found this breakdown helpful, consider subscribing so you don't miss the update the moment the official 2027 COLA is announced, and drop a comment letting me know how this potential increase might affect your household, because I read through these regularly and it genuinely helps shape what we cover next.